Hello, everybody. Welcome to the April seminar of the Canadian Meteorological Oceanographic Society Ottawa Centre Group. We're very happy today to welcome Yifeng Wang from Queen's University to talk to us. And before I introduce her in detail, I'll just go through an acknowledgement of those supporting this seminar. First of all, Abigail Dalton, who is a member of our executive committee, who is at the University of Ottawa, and she will host the chat session, which is conducted is the discussion that is that handles only through chat. So we do not have an oral discussion. In person, we have it through chat, and Abigail will host that. And then Denis Burke, our manager of the Zoom session, thank you for all your background work on this, which will also include recording this session and posting it on the National CMOS YouTube website, which you can link to from our website. And finally, Bob Jones, who is our Ottawa Centre webmaster, who arranges the posting of the seminars and other information, and is our national archivist for CMOS. Finally, let me start by introducing Yifeng. She's a dynamic doctoral student at Queen's University. Originally stems from the Ottawa region, has a master's in geography from the University of Ottawa and an undergraduate degree as well. Yifeng's focus is on investigating distribution and sensitivity to climate change of northern permafrost in the coastal Labrador region that's underlain by peat. And she's a member of the Northern Environment Geoscience Laboratory, led by Robert Way, Dr. Robert Way. And Robert is also has his roots in Ottawa, so there's quite a strong permafrost community here in Ottawa. So Yifeng, you've just come back from a field program in March, and you're going to be talking to us today about the distribution of peatland permafrost in coastal Labrador. Please, without further ado, welcome.
Perfect. Thank you so much for the introduction. So thanks everyone for coming today. I really appreciate the opportunity to share some of my work with you all. As Leonard mentioned, my name is Yifeng, and as mentioned, I am a PhD candidate in the Department of Geography and Planning at Queen's University. And while I am a student in Kingston, I am still based in Ottawa, and I have been a CMOS Ottawa student member for a few years now since my master's. So at Queen's University, I'm a member of the Northern Environmental Geoscience Laboratory, which is led by Dr. Robert Way, who is an assistant professor at Queen's University. And our group conducts all kinds of terrestrial cryospheric research in Labrador, and this includes work on permafrost, on snow, and glaciers as well. My research, however, is focused specifically on peatland permafrost in coastal Labrador, and today I'll be presenting on a recent study of ours that aims to encourage scientists and academics in particular to reconsider our previous understanding of the distribution of peatland permafrost in coastal Labrador. So before jumping into the content of the study itself, I did want to just start off by acknowledging all of our research partners and funders. So as mentioned, I'm part of the NEGL, the Northern Environmental Geoscience Laboratory, led by Dr. Robert Way. And then our research team includes other members of our lab, including Jordan Beer and Victoria Collin, who are currently master's students in our lab. We also have Annika Farget, who's just wrapping up her master's and currently works for the Canadian Sea Ice Service based out of Montreal. And then we also have Rosie Tutton, who finished up her master's a few years ago, and she's currently based in Yellowknife with Global Water Futures. For this project, we've also worked quite closely with Meredith Purcell, who is the wildlife analyst with Torngat Wildlife Plants and Fisheries Secretariat, which is an organization that's based in Happy Valley Goose Bay. And this project itself is funded by NSERC, so the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council of Canada. But I've also been quite lucky to receive additional field support through both Queen's University and also through the Northern Scientific Training Program. I also wanted to note that our research is conducted on traditional Inuit and Innu lands throughout Labrador. So we're really grateful for the support and also for opportunities for collaboration with partners and staff from the Nunatsiavut Research Centre, the Nunatsiavut Government, Innu Nation, and also the Nunatsiavut Community Council. So here, as Leonard's already mentioned this, but I would like to provide just a little bit of information about me and how I ended up here. And somehow I'm already in the third year of my PhD, and I try not to think about that too hard sometimes. But I would probably identify and introduce myself as an early career permafrost scientist, but I didn't start off in permafrost. So I actually started off in biomedical sciences at the University of Ottawa. And through that 4-year degree, I very quickly realized that I was not at all in the right field. So after my undergrad, I swapped over to do a Master's of Science in Geography at the same university, so at the University of Ottawa. And there I worked under the supervision of Dr. Tony Lefkowitz. So my master's research was focused on permafrost conditions in Labrador as well, but specifically under the context of forest fires. And while I was there, I realized just how understudied this region is, particularly in terms of permafrost conditions. So because of this and because of how much I loved the community connections that I had formed while working in the region, I decided to carry on and do a PhD in geography with Dr. Robert Way at Queen's University. And this opportunity has really allowed me to continue to work in Labrador and continue to build on the connections that I had formed during my master's. So for those of you who aren't super familiar with Labrador, I definitely wasn't until I started working here. So I did just want to give a quick overview of the region. Labrador is the continental portion of the province of Newfoundland and Labrador. But unfortunately, I think that a lot of the general public often forgets about this region when they think about the north. So I think when people think about the north, the first places that are going to come to mind are probably going to be the 3 territories. So Yukon Territory, the Northwest Territories, and Nunavut. But I would argue that Labrador is definitely just as north and just as isolated and just as remote, but also just as beautiful as any of these places. This slide here shows some selected communities in Labrador shown in blue, and you can see that the majority of Labrador's communities are actually found along the coast, and they can generally be split into the north coast and the south coast. So the north coast includes 5 Nunatsiavut communities, so 5 Inuit communities and 1 Innu community, and these are all fly-in only by Twin Otter service, especially in winter. The Twin Otter service continues in summer, but in summer there's also a weekly ferry service as well. The South Coast certainly has more communities, and most of them are connected to each other through the Trans-Labrador Highway, shown here in brown, or through offshoots from the Trans-Labrador Highway. And a bit of a fun fact is that this highway was actually recently fully paved. So whenever we travel into the field, we actually drive in. We rent a truck from Kingston and drive all the way through Quebec into Labrador and to Goose Bay, and then we continue on to our sites on the South Coast. So if anyone here is interested in doing a road trip from Ottawa, it's actually super doable, and you could probably get all the way to the other end of the Trans-Labrador Highway in maybe 4 days. So I'm extremely lucky that my research has taken me all along the coastline, from as far south as Blanc-Sablon, which is actually in Quebec, all the way up to Nain. So this kind of south to north transect covers around 700 kilometers, and overall conditions obviously vary quite a bit along this transect. So for example, mean annual air temperatures are quite different. So in Blanc-Sablon, the average is around plus 0.6 degrees. And then in Nain, the average is minus 2.5 degrees. The snow to rain fraction, for example, also increases with latitude as we move along the coast. This isn't particularly related to my research, but it is something that we encounter, and I thought it'd be something kind of interesting to share. But another fun little thing that changes along the coastline is actually the time zone. So our study sites for this overarching project actually fall into 3 time zones. Most of Labrador is in Atlantic time. So when we're working in central Labrador or working on the north coast, we work on Atlantic time. When we get down into the Straits area, which is the southernmost part of the south coast, we swap over to Newfoundland time. So we're a half hour ahead. And then the worst part is just when we get into Blanc-Sablon in Quebec, we swap an hour and a half back and we end up back in Eastern time. So that's kind of fun, kind of hectic. If anyone ever does do the drive and takes the ferry from Blanc-Sablon over to Newfoundland, just make sure you know what time zone the ferry leaves. because we definitely almost missed a boat last summer. So now that we're a little bit more familiar with Labrador, I did want to do another quick little overview on permafrost, since we're here to talk about permafrost in Labrador. So permafrost refers to ground or earth materials that remain below 0 degrees Celsius for at least 2 consecutive years. So this definition is a thermal definition, so it's based on the temperature threshold of 0 degrees Celsius. And I would argue that permafrost is actually one of the more difficult aspects of the cryosphere to study because of this thermal definition, and because unlike other elements like snow or sea ice or glaciers, you can't always see permafrost. In most cases, in places with lots of ground ice, so for example, in this slide, you can see a permafrost core and there's some layers of ice in there. So in places where there's a lot of this ice, permafrost or evidence of permafrost might present itself through specific landforms or processes, but that's not always the case. So it can be really difficult to study sometimes. Despite how difficult it can sometimes be to understand where permafrost is found and what the conditions are, I think it's also one of the more interesting aspects of the cryosphere to study. No offense to any glaciologists or iceberg specialists here, but I would argue that this is because people in the north live on permafrost and deal with permafrost on a daily basis. So in northern environments, changes to communities, to infrastructure, to cultural practices, to wildlife, ecology, hydrology, and the list goes on. All of these can be linked to permafrost. So it's definitely a really, really important topic of study. So this map right here is a representation of where permafrost can be found in Canada, or where it's modeled to be found in Canada. So permafrost distribution is usually classified according to categories of continuous, discontinuous, and isolated patches of permafrost. So if an area is classified within the continuous permafrost zone, so represented here in the darkest purple, that means that permafrost is found almost everywhere in 90 to 100% of the area. If it's classified within the discontinuous permafrost zone, which can later be subdivided into the extensive and sporadic permafrost zones, that means that permafrost is found anywhere between 10 to 90% of the area. And finally, if an area is classified within the isolated patches of permafrost zone, represented here in the lightest pink, this means that permafrost is only found in small pockets covering less than 10% of the area. You can see from this map that about half of Canada is considered to be underlain by permafrost, whether it's continuous, discontinuous, or isolated patches. However, I would argue that our overall understanding of permafrost distribution in Eastern Canada, particularly in Labrador, is unfortunately quite poor due to a general lack of field-based permafrost measurements from the region. So in Labrador, as in most of Canada, permafrost distribution is thought to follow a largely latitudinal pattern. And in this region, these broad patterns are definitely dictated by the cold Labrador Sea current from the adjacent Labrador Sea. Large proportions of Labrador are classified in the zones of sporadic or isolated patches of permafrost. They're shown here in like the bright fuchsia and the light pink, meaning that up to only 50% or 10% of these areas are expected to be underlain by permafrost. Now, this general understanding of permafrost distribution for this particular region is primarily attributed to surveying work that was done by Roger Brown, who was a permafrost scientist with the National Research Council of Canada. So in 1975, he published a report on permafrost investigations in Quebec and Newfoundland, with Labrador in brackets. And he summarized his observations from a series of helicopter survey lines that he flew in the late 1960s that are shown here in yellow. So Roger Brown flew along these helicopter survey lines and evaluated permafrost presence or absence at 92 locations along these lines. So locations that where Roger Brown found permafrost are represented here in blue, and then locations where permafrost was absent are shown here in red. In Labrador, most of the locations in blue with permafrost occurred in peatlands, and this is because thick layers of peat can help to promote permafrost development and persistence. So peatland permafrost, which is the kind of permafrost that I study, typically manifests itself in the form of two key landforms. On the left here, we have palsas, which are individual mounds of frozen peat and sediment. On the right, we have peat plateaus, which are large, continuous, elevated fields of frozen peat. Now in Western Canada, we also have peatland permafrost, but the landforms out there are typically wooded, so they're usually characterized by very dense black spruce forests. However, in coastal Labrador, you can see from these images that we find peatland permafrost landforms that are not wooded. So we would say that the landforms that we find out in Labrador are actually more similar to the kinds of peatland permafrost landforms that you might find in parts of Northern Europe, such as Norway, Sweden, and Finland. Peatland permafrost tends to represent the southernmost occurrences of permafrost because the thick layers of peat help to insulate the landforms and keep the ground cold. So the peat can offer protection and resilience to these landforms under conditions that otherwise would probably be too warm and no longer favorable for permafrost persistence. Now, we've had a lot of buildup here with a long introduction, lots of context into Labrador and permafrost and peatland permafrost. And before we jumped into the study, I did just want to provide one last little bit of context to help explain why we care so much about palsas and peat plateaus and peatland permafrost in general. And I think this kind of question needs to be answered at multiple scales. So permafrost and peatlands and peatland permafrost are all recognized to store vast amounts of carbon. Accelerated thaw of permafrost due to climate and ecosystem changes is expected to lead to accelerated breakdown and release of carbon from these environments as greenhouse gases, such as carbon dioxide and methane. So we definitely want to be sure that the distribution and the sensitivity of peatland permafrost from this region of northeastern Canada is appropriately accounted for in global models. Regionally, peatland permafrost can also have impacts on the economy and on infrastructure. So through the development of either built infrastructure like houses and buildings, or linear infrastructure like roads and airstrips. So this is an example of built infrastructure. It's an example of the Puff and Snacks convenience store in the community of Nain. And you can see that the building is actually slanted down on its left corner, and that's due to permafrost thaw. So Puff and Snacks unfortunately closed down a few years ago during the pandemic. But for those of you who are from Ottawa, who are familiar with the Science and Technology Museum and the crazy kitchen that they have in there, I would say that walking inside Puff and Snacks actually feels quite a bit like that because the floor is kind of slanted and all the proportions feel really off. And for those of you who aren't familiar with that museum and that exhibit, I've also heard people describe being inside this building as kind of like being inside a boat where it's just always slanted one way. So currently, in terms of linear infrastructure, there are talks and early feasibility studies in progress for two large infrastructure projects in Labrador. The first is the relocation of the airstrip for this particular community, for the community of Nain in northern Labrador. And the second project is the potential development of a highway from central Labrador up into the north coast to service all 6 communities that are found up there. So if any of these projects, either the airstrip, the road between the community and the airstrip, or the highway itself were to pass through thaw-sensitive terrain, such as peatland permafrost, this would definitely be really expensive and really costly for local residents, for the province and the federal government as well, depending on where the funding is coming from. And last but certainly not least, from a local perspective, frozen peatlands are ecologically and culturally important landscapes for Labrador Inuit and Innu. When we're out in the field, we actually often see a lot of local residents out at our sites or out at nearby sites, and they're usually picking bake apples, which I think in Western Canada is also known as cloudberries. So the raised nature of palsas and peat plateaus actually makes these spots really great for important plants like bake apples, but also for lichens, which are an important food source for caribou, which is another culturally relevant species. Through our work, we've also seen evidence of fox dens in some of the landforms themselves. So local residents might set up fox traps on top of palsas. And a lot of people and guides that we've talked to about field spots have noted that the sites that we're interested in for this work are often also good spots for goose hunting and moose hunting as well. So changes to the integrity of the permafrost in these spots would certainly impact all of these kinds of activities, including berry picking, fox trapping, and goose hunting. So we recognize the importance and relevance of these landscapes for local peoples, and we hope that our work will help to keep people informed of local changes to these kinds of environments. So all of this kind of leads us to the question of where is peatland permafrost found in Labrador? So according to 3 models that were published quite recently in 2020 and 2021, this is where we can find peatland permafrost in Labrador, with darker purple representing either peatland permafrost presence or peatland permafrost presence at higher coverage. But you can see from this slide that these 3 maps don't necessarily agree with one another. So in general, I think it's safe to say that the academic community views peatland permafrost as being largely absent along the coast, except maybe in certain sections, and as being possibly present in the western interior. However, Labrador Inuit and Innu, as I mentioned in the last slide, have historically used and still continue to use coastal frozen peatlands to this day for traditional activities, including berry picking, hunting, and trapping. suggesting that there's actually a lot more peatland permafrost along the coast than what's been modeled. So we set out to figure out where peatland permafrost is really found in Labrador by mapping it out. Now, when we first started this project, we naively thought that we could just look into existing distribution estimates for wetlands and peatlands in Labrador and use that as a starting point, but that actually didn't work out so well. And it's kind of the same reason that the previous representations didn't work out so well either. And it's because we can see that there's a lot of disagreement between wetland and peatland distribution models for Labrador. So here on this slide, we have 9 different representations with darker green representing wetlands either present or present at higher coverage. And the disagreement's pretty stark. So some models, like the one in the upper right, so panel C, shows quite a bit of wetlands along the coast, but then panel D, the left middle one, shows very few wetlands or peatlands at all. The overall lack of agreement between these products actually personally made me feel better about the peatland permafrost products from the previous slide, because if we aren't sure where the peatlands are, no wonder it's so difficult to model where the peatland permafrost is. So instead of modeling peatland permafrost in the area, we thought we would take a step back to see if we could map it out. And that leads me to our study objectives. So the objectives for this particular study were 1, to develop a point inventory of peatland permafrost complexes in coastal Labrador using a multi-stage consensus-based review process. 2 was to characterize the distribution of peatland permafrost in coastal Labrador using selected climatic and physiographic variables. And 3 was to provide insights into the reliability of existing peatland permafrost and permafrost distribution products for this region. So for this study, we set out to map out peatland permafrost complexes within a study area boundary of 100 kilometers from the Labrador Sea coastline, including sections along both the north coast and the south coast so that we could capture the full coastline, as well as a small portion along the mouth of the Gulf of St. Lawrence so that we could capture the community of Blas-Sablon and its surrounding areas. So here's an overview of our overall inventorying process. And as mentioned, the process went through multiple stages. Stage 1 was the mapping and identification stage. Stage 2 was a quality control. Stage 3 was the consensus-based review. And finally, stage 4 involved integrating a field validation data set to form our final inventory. So here I'll just start off with an overview of stage 1. So for stage 1, we conducted the study using Esri's ArcGIS Online. So a team of 3 mappers, myself, my colleague Jordan Beer, and our supervisor, Dr. Robert Way. We spent a long time during the pandemic lockdown just kind of sitting on our computers on Esri ArcGIS Online, looking for and mapping out potential peatland permafrost complexes. So for this project, we used the World Imagery Base Map, which consisted of a mosaic of high-resolution satellite imagery from 2010 to 2020. And this was an excellent and affordable source of high-resolution satellite imagery. And I would say that without this base layer, this project definitely would not have been possible. So we were really lucky to have this kind of imagery covering such a large area and at such a reasonable resolution. For this study, our team of 3 mappers identified over 2,000 wetland complexes in coastal Labrador that potentially contained peatland permafrost. After stage 1, we had mapped out 2,172 potential peatland permafrost sites, but we wanted to make sure that all of the points represent individual and unique wetland complexes. So for stage 2, for our quality control, we went through the preliminary inventory and removed any duplicate points. So in cases where maybe 2 mappers or even 3 mappers accidentally picked out the same wetland, we would remove 1 point to ensure that we only had 1 point representing 1 complex. After this quality control, we were left with a full inventory of 2,092 potential peatland permafrost complexes. Our next stage, stage 3, was our consensus-based review stage, and I'll explain that here with a little bit of a diagram. For this consensus-based review, we went back to our original mapping team, so myself, Jordan, and Rob, and we had 2 of the 3 mappers independently review each prospective peatland permafrost complex. So here's an example of a prospective peatland permafrost complex that we had identified near the community of Riglet. So if mapper 1 assessed this complex as yes, containing peatland permafrost, and mapper 2 also assessed this complex as yes, containing peatland permafrost, then we would classify this location as likely to contain peatland permafrost. If mapper 1 assessed this complex as no, not containing peatland permafrost, and mapper 2 also agreed that this complex did not contain palsas or peat plateaus, then we would classify this complex as unlikely to contain peatland permafrost. Finally, if mapper 1 and mapper 2 disagreed, where one person thought yes and one person thought no, then we would classify this complex as possibly containing peatland permafrost. And we think that some kind of field-based validation would probably be required before we'd feel comfortable putting these complexes into either likely or unlikely categories. We felt that this consensus-based review process helped to improve our confidence in the final results of our inventory. And at this point, all 3 mappers had had plenty of experience working with peatland permafrost, particularly in Labrador, both in the field and through remote sensing, which was definitely very helpful. So ultimately, for this particular complex that we found near Rigolet, it was classified as a likely peatland permafrost complex. And we were also able to verify that, yes, indeed, it contained peatland permafrost by visiting this site in summer 2021. So once we finished the review, which was stage 3, we were ready to move on to stage 4. And I'll be covering the steps of stage 4 in more detail here, as I really want to stress the importance of incorporating solid validation in this kind of remote sensing-based inventory development. So during summer 2021 and summer 2022, teams of 3 students visited and surveyed almost 30% of our inventory locations. So validation methods included dedicated field visits and imagery acquisition using drones, helicopter surveys, and photos taken while on commercial twin otter flights. So dedicated field visits consisted of frost probing, collecting instantaneous temperature measurements, and collecting site photos using a handheld digital camera. We were lucky that field visits were able to be conducted on rainy, poor weather days, but they were definitely limited based on their accessibility and proximity to the Trans-Labrador Highway when we were traveling by truck, or their proximity to an appropriate shoreline when we were traveling by speedboat. In general, these visits were concentrated around communities or along a road. Dedicated imagery acquisition missions were also completed using either a DJI Mini 2 mini drone or a DJI Mini 3 mini drone. And this technique was especially useful for surveying locations that were just a little bit less accessible from the road or a shoreline. But this technique was definitely also limited by the drone's battery life and signal, and also by weather conditions. So we were only able to use this technique to survey locations within 2 to 3 kilometers of the home point, or on days where it wasn't raining and there was minimal wind. Georeference videos were also acquired from helicopter surveys that were flown by our partners at the Torngat Wildlife, Plants and Fisheries Secretariat. So we mounted a Hero 9 GoPro onto a helicopter, and it was used to survey remote locations from Goose Bay all the way up to the Torngat Mountains National Park. And this was super, super helpful for surveying locations that we otherwise would have had no way to access. So here's a map showing the route of the helicopter survey shown in green that was flown by the Torngat Wildlife, Plants and Fisheries Secretariat. So it started in Goose Bay and went all the way up to the Torngat Mountains National Park. And you can see that the route does follow the coastline on the way up. So we were really lucky that Meredith Purcell with Torngat Secretariat was able to help us customize the survey route so that we could validate as many peatland permafrost complexes as possible. The resulting 8 hours of video footage that was collected was also used by Torngat Secretariat to help scout out some potential monitoring sites for a new goose monitoring project that they have on the go. So we were really happy that we were able to work with this group to help collect data that was used both for our inventory validation and also for their goose monitoring project. And finally, images of prospective peatland permafrost locations were also collected during commercial twin otter flights that were taken throughout both summers, 2021 and 2022, whenever we traveled between communities. So this was tricky on some days when flying conditions weren't super favorable, such as days maybe with low cloud cover, but we were very lucky in summer 2022. We had incredible flying conditions, and this allowed us to get some great shots of some peatland permafrost complexes between the communities of Cartwright and Black Tickle. While this method was also very useful for surveying more remote locations, unlike the helicopter survey, we weren't really able to customize the commercial flight routes. So the survey locations that were validated using this method were fully dependent on the existing flight route between the 2 communities. And at some locations, we were able to apply a combination of validation methods, and this form of cross-validation helped to improve our confidence in our evaluations of permafrost presence or absence. So this is an example of a palsa field located near the community of Rigolet, where we were able to validate the presence of peatland permafrost using twin otter photos, drone surveys, and also field visits. And I would like to note that yes, those black dots on the screen are indeed black flies. So Labrador is very buggy. Ultimately, locations where field visits were performed and locations that were cross-validated using multiple methods, these were the locations where we had the highest confidence in our evaluations of permafrost presence or absence. I do want to note, though, that it can actually be quite difficult to interpret peatland permafrost presence or absence in some locations, and this is due to the overall subtleness of some of these features, especially further south. So throughout coastal Labrador, there are many peatlands, but not all of them contain permafrost. So while some features are more evident, others are definitely much more subtle. So this is an example of a peatland near Cartwright at a location called Muddy Bay. We're using just imagery-based validation methods. We might have ruled out the presence of active peatland permafrost at this location. However, frost probing during our field visit revealed the presence of permafrost within 120 centimeters of the ground surface at a couple of spots. So thanks to this field visit, we've now been able to classify this location as, yes, indeed containing peatland permafrost. Here's another example of a peatland located up near Rigolet that at first seemed pretty promising in terms of containing peatland permafrost, just based on our assessment of high-resolution satellite imagery. But when we arrived at the site, we weren't really able to find any raised or elevated mounds or anything that really resembled a peatland permafrost landform. So thanks to this field visit, we've now been able to classify this location as no, not containing peatland permafrost landforms. And ultimately, through field visits, drone flights, the helicopter survey, and several Twin Otter flight segments, we were able to validate peatland permafrost presence or absence at 557 prospective peatland permafrost complexes, which represents almost 30% of our full inventory. Ultimately, 311 of these complexes were assessed as containing peatland permafrost landforms, and they're represented using the colored dots there based on the method of validation. And you can see that they're all found in outer coastal spots, and that validation efforts that were focused in inland spots, either along the Trans-Labrador Highway or along flight paths, these primarily led to confirmations of no peatland permafrost, and they're represented there in the gray dots. So at the end of stage 4, we combined our data set of 557 validated complexes with our review assessed inventory from stage 3, resulting in a final inventory of 1,119 likely peatland permafrost complexes, 187 possible peatland permafrost complexes, and 786 unlikely peatland permafrost complexes. By validating 30% of our inventory, we were able to reduce the number of possible complexes from 226 in stage 3 to 187 in stage 4. And so our final inventory contains over 1,000 likely peatland permafrost complexes shown in dark blue, just under 200 possible complexes shown in light blue, and about 800 unlikely peatland permafrost complexes shown in red. So we actually found likely peatland permafrost complexes all along the coastline from Blanc-Sablon in Quebec all the way up into the Torngat Mountains National Park in northern Labrador. But the largest clusters of these complexes and the highest densities of these complexes were found between the communities of McCovic and Black Tickle. And they're actually represented in panel B of this figure with the darker blue squares. We also looked into the differences in climatic and physiographic variables for each of the likely, possible, and unlikely classes of peatland permafrost complexes. And we found that the likely complexes were closer to the coastline with a mean distance from coastline of 2.6 kilometers. And they were also found in lowland locations with a mean elevation of 29 meters above sea level. In comparison, the class of unlikely peatland permafrost complexes in red, they were located further from the coastline, so they had an average distance of 10.7 kilometers from the coast. They were at higher elevations, so they had an average elevation of 78 meters above sea level, and they also had higher mean annual air temperatures with an average of minus 0.5 degrees Celsius. So here I'd like to bring us back to those 3 maps of peatland permafrost distribution that I had showed earlier on, except now I've overlaid the resulting points from our coastal Labrador peatland permafrost inventory. And comparisons between our results and these products show that peatland permafrost has been poorly represented along the Labrador coastline. As previously mentioned in the past slide, the highest densities of likely peatland permafrost complexes were found between McCovic and Black Tickle, so the spots with the most blue dots there. And these are spots where all 3 of these other maps show that there is no peatland permafrost or very little. Instead, the first and third maps do show peatland permafrost further up the coast, but this is a spot where we actually found far fewer peatland permafrost. So some of this likely has to do with how the models are being run and what kind of variables are being included in them. So for example, models that are just using existing peatland data sets, but then applying climatic limits to predict where permafrost might be found, they're likely to do quite poorly for this region. And this is for two reasons. One is due to the disagreement that we have between wetland and peatland distribution, as I showed previously. And two is because peatland permafrost presence relies on more than just cold air temperatures. We think that models need to include more physiographic variables, including soil conditions, frost susceptibility, marine limits, and vegetation cover, so that we can begin to better represent peatland permafrost in northern coastal regions like Labrador. As part of the study, we also classified each of the likely and possible complexes according to the peatland permafrost landform type that they contained. So this would be either palsa, peat plateau, or mixed palsa and peat plateau. And we would typically get mixed palsas and peat plateaus in spots where maybe the peat plateau had degraded to the point where it kind of just looked like individual mounds. So when we decided to include this additional analysis as a way to understand permafrost coverage by area, as we presume that palsa bogs, which contain the individual frozen mounds, would contain less extensive permafrost than a peat plateau complex, which is more continuous. So about half of the complexes were classified as palsa bogs, shown in orange. And you can see from this figure that all of these orange spots they're stretched all along the coastline. Now for peat plateaus, just under 30% of the complexes were classified as peat plateaus, and these are much more concentrated. They're shown in purple here, and they're mostly found between Cartwright and Black Tickle. So in panel B of this figure, we can see that a lot of these purple points are found in the isolated patches of permafrost zone, shown in light pink. And this is the spot where permafrost is expected to be found in only 10% of the area. But based on our inventorying work, we think that the sporadic discontinuous permafrost limit could be reasonably extended south by 110 kilometers to include these large swaths of peatland permafrost, and particularly these large swaths of peat plateaus, which are expected to be more continuous and to have more extensive permafrost than, say, a palsa bog. So here's a zoom into that same region there with the highest density of peatland permafrost complexes. And here, hopefully, we can see a bit more clearly that the sporadic permafrost zone, shown in darker pink, stops just above this bay right here, which is called Sandwich Bay, and then it doesn't continue any further on. So as mentioned, we think that the sporadic discontinuous permafrost limit, represented here in the dark pink, we think it should be extended south to include the large swaths of peatland permafrost that are found to the south and southeast of Sandwich Bay. And what's kind of interesting is that we aren't the first researchers to think that there is more permafrost along the coast than what's currently modeled. So on the left here, we have our representation of permafrost distribution in Quebec and Labrador, which I've shown many, many times throughout this presentation. And this is based on the permafrost map of Canada. But on the right, we have a representation of permafrost distribution for the exact same region in a publication by Serge Payette from 2001. And these zones and their boundaries were informed by vegetation mapping and geomorphology. We can see that in Payette's representation, much of the Labrador Sea coastline is actually classified as Zone B, which is discontinuous permafrost, where 50 to 90% of the area may be underlain by permafrost. So this further emphasizes the importance of considering physiographic variables like vegetation cover and geomorphological conditions when we're doing permafrost mapping, especially in the absence of other kinds of data like boreholes or permafrost cores, which we already know are unfortunately lacking in this understudied part of northern Canada. So all of this work was recently bundled up together into a manuscript entitled Significant Underestimation of Peatland Permafrost along the Labrador Sea Coastline in northern Canada. And it was published in the Cryosphere, which is an open access journal, earlier this year. So if anyone's interested, the article's up there and it's freely available to access. My colleague, Victoria Collins, she's super talented, and she also put this infographic together to help summarize our study and to help share our results. So to summarize, frozen peatlands are important environments for a whole variety of reasons, and change to these kinds of landscapes can have impacts on global carbon storage, on regional and community infrastructure, and local ecosystems and cultural practices. In order for people in coastal Labrador to figure out ways to adapt to some of these potential changes and impacts, it's really important for us to understand how and where peatland permafrost is distributed in this region. So for this study, we applied a multi-stage consensus-based inventorying approach to develop a point-based inventory of peatland permafrost complexes in coastal Labrador. And we supported the development of this inventory by extensive field, drone, helicopter, and twin otter validation efforts. Ultimately, our results showed a lot of peatland permafrost along the coast, much more than what has been predicted in existing models. And we also expect this work to improve future permafrost, peatland permafrost, and carbon mapping efforts, to improve infrastructure and climate change adaptation strategy development, and also to inform wildlife management considerations for the region. And in terms of our next steps with this inventory, we actually just plan to keep on going. So with a project like this, it's really important to keep in mind that this inventory is just a first attempt at mapping peatland permafrost in this region. We decided to use multiple mappers, so we had 3 mappers, and we figured that this would help us to maximize the inclusion of as many peatland permafrost complexes as possible. But because of the resolution of the satellite imagery, we were probably skewed towards mapping some of the larger and more obvious spots. Since publication in January, we have continued to add in prospective peatland permafrost complexes that our team will continue to review, and that will also continue to validate through both field and imagery-based methods in upcoming summers. The dataset for this project was also placed in the NORDICAN-D data repository, so it's also free, it's accessible to the public, and we do plan to update the dataset in NORDICAN-D with new versions as we go along with updating the inventory. And in terms of immediate plans for the use of this data set, my colleague Jordan Beer is actually currently working on a model of peatland permafrost distribution in Labrador, and she plans to use our inventory of points to help train her model. So hopefully with this training data set that was partially validated with field and imagery-based methods, and with the incorporation of more physiographic variables like superficial materials and vegetation cover, we hope that Jordan's model will help to do a better job at representing peatland permafrost in Labrador's coastal spots. So here I've just included some more information about our overall research program and our research lab that's led by Dr. Robert Wang. We have our website at labradorgeolab.ca with more information about our research lab members, our publications, our presentations, our infographics, and also data sets. We also have links to some weather stations and weather station data that our lab manages, and also some information on potential opportunities for anyone if they're interested in joining our lab, or if they know anyone who's looking for an opportunity like that. We also have Instagram and Twitter, but if anyone has any questions, the best bet would probably be just to email any of our lab members or Rob directly. And that's it for me. Thanks very much for listening, and I'd be happy to take some questions.
Thanks so much, Yifeng. This was super fascinating. And yeah, love hearing about your work. There's a couple questions in the chat. So the first one is asking, it's a multi-part question. So have your observations increased the accuracy of mapping permafrost by satellite? And then which satellite observations are most useful in mapping coastal peatlands, and are satellites of the future likely to improve that mapping?
Sorry, what was the first part of that question?
So have your observations increased the accuracy of mapping permafrost by satellite?
Like I do think that our observations in terms of like our experience in our personal familiarity and expertise with peatland permafrost has helped with our mapping now, because I will say when we first started, I had no idea what a palsa was. I had no idea what they looked like. So being in the field for 2 summers and kind of standing on a palsa and knowing what they look like in person and also through satellite imagery, that's personally helped me to better identify peatland permafrost from satellite imagery. And I think that that kind of expertise is really important in a project like this, because without that kind of experience and field experience, I think that that's where a lot of the models have run into problems, where they're mapping out peatland permafrost in spots where there isn't, or they're missing really large swaths of it.
Mm-hmm. So after going into the field, did you have to like go back to your inventory and think, okay, maybe that isn't, or that is?
Yeah, definitely, yeah.
So yeah, the second part of that question was, which satellite observations are most useful in mapping coastal peatlands?
I guess like I would say that optical imagery is definitely the most useful for this kind of project, just because you're able to see it directly. I'm not as familiar with other kinds of satellite imagery, but we had high resolution optical imagery that was really great, and the base map from ArcGIS Online, it's pretty good at kind of not including clouds and not including snow cover, so it was really good for mapping out the pulses and the peat plateaus in our study area.
Did you use any like DEMs, like digital elevation models at all, to look at like elevation just so that you could see if a pulsar was there or not, or was it kind of just like visual features from our optical imagery?
It was mostly visual, but we did also use ArcScene. And they had kind of a representation of like the general elevation of the area, but because, especially for pulses, it's a little bit trickier because they're so small. So I think you would need something probably at a higher resolution for that.
Makes sense.
Mhm.
The next question asks, can one conclude from your work that it is impossible, or maybe possible, to build a road between Labrador communities?
Oh, that's a tricky one. I don't know if I'm really like the best person to talk about that. There are currently like feasibility studies in progress in the northern communities to kind of see if people even want a road and if it's kind of the best option. I think it will be tricky. I don't think it's impossible, but yeah, like I definitely don't think it's impossible because we have roads in other parts of northern Canada. But I think it's a project that needs to be done really carefully if we want to avoid crazy costs for residents and the province and the federal government as well.
Nicholas has a question. I wonder if it's possible to unmute so he could kind of give a bit of background as well, but he looks like he's working on remote sensing classification of peatland permafrost on a national scale. His model captures the complexes on the coast, but based on your work, it appears to be underestimating it. So he said, you mentioned tree cover as a difference, but are there any other notable differences between Western and Eastern peatland permafrost complexes?
That's a really good question. I'm definitely not as familiar with the ones in Western Canada, but tree cover would definitely be one of the more stark differences. Like, I think a lot of the literature that I had read, they would say like, oh, it's so easy to identify peatland permafrost because you just look for like islands of trees. And for us, that's not at all useful for us. Like,
Right.
I think it kind of depends. I do think hydrology is a really big part of it as well. But my colleague Jordan is currently working on kind of mapping out and modeling out peatland permafrost, and she's looking into different like surficial material data sets. And I think marine limits will also play a really big role in that in terms of kind of sediment composition and frost susceptibility.
Makes sense. So like what kind of vegetation, like you mentioned some spruce forests, I think, like, but other than that, like it's mostly shrubs and like smaller vegetation present in Labrador. That isn't necessarily a good indicator of the presence
I
of.
think, yeah, like I think for us, like lichen is probably one of the most, like the best indicators for peatland permafrost. There's like a couple species of lichen that, so we had partnered with a student at the University of Waterloo last summer, and we did just 20 plots at permafrost and non-permafrost spots within a wetland, and he found some differences in terms of like species composition of different lichens and different like berry plants and things like that. So there are definitely differences, but I'm just not sure, like if we're mapping on a national scale, I think it might be tricky to get that kind of species level information at that scale.
Yeah. Helen asks, with a warming climate, are you seeing more impacts of thawing permafrost on linear or built infrastructure in Labrador? So, for example, around hydroelectric developments or coastal communities?
That's a really good question. So right now, like most of the linear infrastructure that we have in Labrador is, it's probably concentrated more in the southern parts. And I think that permafrost does play a role in that, but also there's a lot of greening going on. I think there's more than just like climate warming. There's also ecosystem modifications as well. It's definitely a pretty complex topic. I'm not really sure if I know the best answer to that. So,
what kind of like feedback have you received from the community about like your work in relation to that, in relation to infrastructure, things like that?
yeah, so we have received a little bit. So we were pretty lucky this past March when we were up in Labrador for field work. We went to the community of Cartwright and we gave 2 community presentations, and people were really, really interested in seeing our work, and also especially just seeing the difference in kind of what people are seeing with models versus what we've shown. And it's funny because all the people that are local to Labrador, they know where all these mountains are. They know that there's peatland permafrost everywhere. They might not have known that it was permafrost that was in them, but they're very familiar with the landscape. So I think it was a bit of a shock to see that there was such a big disagreement in the products. And in terms of infrastructure itself, we have been talking a little bit with the people who are doing the pre-feasibility projects. for the road, and we've sent along kind of our paper and our data set. So we're definitely open to discussions about ways that permafrost needs to be considered in these kinds of projects. But I think for those projects, both the airstrip and the road, I think they're going to be a long way down. Like, I think it's going to take years before kind of things get rolling with that.
Are there any efforts at this point to like train community members, or is there interest like for them to continue monitoring or like expand the monitoring that you guys have already started?
Yeah, like we would absolutely love to do that. And we do have intentions for sure. It's been quite tricky with COVID. This past March was really our first opportunity to go into a community and like meet with people in person. And we have plans to like take community members out berry picking at places where we have peatland permafrost. But with COVID, it's definitely been quite tricky just because we don't want to get anyone sick. We don't want to get sick either. So we're hoping that especially this upcoming summer, we're really hoping for more community engagement and more opportunities to kind of keep the project going.
Nice. I see Adam has a follow-up to the first question about satellite imagery. So he's asking, did you ever have discussions about trying to automate the mapping process? For example, trying to identify pulses or plateaus through supervised classification or something like that?
Yeah, so we did have discussions about that. And I think, I don't really know where those went, honestly, but I think a lot of it, like for that kind of stuff, I feel like you would need some kind of training data set for that maybe. And before our inventory, there wasn't really any training information for this region. So maybe from now on, we could explore those options more now that we have this inventory that has been validated through like field studies. But at that point, when we first started this, we were really kind of starting from scratch with this.
Yeah, Adam just commented that it would be an excellent training data set. And I would say I would agree, like this is the starting point, and that's the next step is like, okay, now we have this data set of known locations. So yeah, someone else can do that, or maybe a postdoc or something.
A later problem.
So Bob's asking, did you find any thermal activity at ground level?
What do you mean by thermal activity? Like thermal change, or?
Bob, I don't know if you want to follow up on that. Maybe changes and yeah, I'm not sure.
Yeah. So this project in particular was more about mapping out where peatland permafrost currently is. We definitely did see evidence of like degradation at almost all the sites that we visited. So there was cracking in peatland permafrost. So in the mounds themselves, they typically collapse by block collapse. So the peat might crack and you might see exposed peat that can then like fall off the sides. There's also evidence of ponding. So even in this slide right here, you can see like there's like a couple little ponds that are forming and there's cracking kind of in the middle there. So there is evidence of degradation at basically every site that we visited. And another aspect of my PhD that I'm working on right now is looking at old air photos from the 1940s and the 1990s, and we're looking at change over time. So that part's still definitely in progress. We don't have the full results yet, but there is quite a bit of change going on in these spots. For sure.
Yeah, that was going to be one of my questions was there evidence that in the more like western part of Labrador, there was previously peatland permafrost and it's not there anymore, and now it's kind of like the existing stuff is what's left in the east? Or yeah, you just don't know, and that's kind of the next question maybe.
That's a really good question. So like when we started this project, we weren't fully focused on the coast. Like we always kind of had an idea that there was peatland permafrost on the coast just based on like historical and continued use for berry picking and stuff like that. But when we were going through this process, we did look inland as well, and we just didn't see pulses. Like there were some maybe in the Shefferville area, and also based on literature, there's kind of been some reports of pulses there. But other than that, like there isn't really anything like we've seen along the coast in the more interior parts.
And I guess like there aren't many communities there, so there's really not any like anecdotal evidence of like
definitely not.
Maybe in the past there was permafrost there and they did hunt there, but not anymore, or
definitely not as much. Not as many like active communities inland because most people kind of live along the coast. And
yeah, that makes sense. So what's the plan for summer field work?
That's a great question. It is. That's a great question. I feel like it changes every day. We definitely do want to kind of validate more as the opportunity presents itself. So like we definitely have plans to go back down the south coast. We have monitoring stations there that are recording like air temperature and ground temperature. So we do have to go back, and while we're there, we might as well validate some more spots. And then, yeah, we definitely have to have some conversations, because that's a great question.
That might kind of tie into Bob's question. So he clarified about thermal activity on ground level. So maybe volcanic hot springs. I don't know if that's a thing that exists in Labrador, but I guess, are you trying to incorporate like that air temperature data, or like surface level temperature data to see, you know, what differences are there?
Yeah, so the monitoring information that we have, I actually do plan to incorporate that into a later chapter of my PhD, where I'm planning on doing some thermal modeling to look into, to predict kind of how the peatland permafrost might respond under climate change. So that's kind of, I do plan to kind of use our monitoring temperature records as like validation for future predictions.
That makes sense. Does anybody else have any more questions? Feel free to write them in the chat. I was also wondering, like, generally, how deep is the permafrost in this area? You mentioned at like that Muddy Bay site, it was like 120 centimeters, I think you said, but like, is that typical, or like, does that vary a lot?
Yeah, so at the Muddy Bay site, that was like where we had hit the frost table, so the upper part. But in terms of how deep the permafrost goes, my supervisor, he had done some electrical resistivity tomography surveys, so some geophysical surveys at some peatland permafrost sites as part of his PhD back in 2014 or 2015, and they found that permafrost extended maybe to about 6 or 8 meters at some sites.
Oh, wow. That's really deep.
Depends on the place, of course.
Yeah. Great. I think that's all for questions.
So thank you very much, Abigail, for hosting the chat, and Yifeng, thank you very much for presenting a great seminar. Everyone agrees in the discussion that it was very well presented and interesting. It's leaves us with a much better feeling for the complexity of permafrost and the value of ground truthing operations that you are conducting to the future mapping using, for instance, satellites and other modeling. So thanks very much for doing this. And good luck in your field work endeavors in finishing off.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Before everyone goes, I would like to just remind you of 2 things. One, the CMOS Congress in late May is taking place in St. John's, Newfoundland. Have a look on the website. It's a very, I think, an interesting forum to exchange a whole host of information on earth science and atmospheric science and climate and meteorology. Oceans will certainly be a highlight being in St. John's, Newfoundland. Finally, a reminder that the 21st of September on your calendar, 21st of September, that's the start of fall, roughly, 2023, Saba Ibrahim will be talking, Ontario organizer of the Climate Emergency Unit will be talking on winning the good war, mobilizing Canada for climate emergency. This is a talk that was snowed out in January, if you recall. And Saba Ibrahim is good enough to join us and in leading off our fall season. And then that will be followed up in October, the date to be yet determined, with a talk by David Sills, who is Executive Director of the Northern Tornado Project at Western University. The title is to be also finalized. So that will be in October. So thank you again for everybody for organizing, helping organize this, for presenting, and the attendees for making it successful. Thank you very much.